It was August 20th, 1966, the tail end of winter in Brazil. The air above Niterói was warm but restless, filled with the damp scent of soil after rain. On a slope of Vintém hill, a boy was flying a kite made from newspaper and string. He ran a few meters uphill, letting the breeze tug it higher, and when he turned to check its flight, he saw something in the grass. 2 figures, still. From where he stood, about 50 meters away, the shapes looked almost deliberate. 2 men lying side by side, half covered by weeds. The boy squinted. They weren't sleeping. Their faces were pale, the skin turned waxen in the light. And there was something metallic across their eyes, like the dull glint of tin. He ran down to the road shouting for help. Hours passed before the first investigators climbed the hill. By the time they reached the site, night had fallen. The lights of Rio de Janeiro shimmered faintly across the bay. The wind pressed through the grass, making it whisper and bend. Flashlights carved slow arcs across the slope. Then, in the beam circle, the 2 bodies appeared exactly as the boy had described. Both men were dressed neatly in formal suits under raincoats. They had no signs of struggle, no mud on their shoes, no torn fabric. The grass around them lay flattened but undisturbed. Their arms were at their sides, slightly bent, palms open. On each face sat a pair of roughly cut lead masks, handmade, smooth on the inside, dull and grain-streaked on the surface. The metal was heavy enough to press into the skin, yet they rested perfectly in place, like the closing gesture of a ritual. One investigator noted that their bodies looked as though they had simply lain down to rest. Another wrote that it was as if they had been waiting for something. Between the 2 men was a small notebook wrapped in plastic, a water bottle, and 2 folded towels. In the notebook, there was a single page torn from a larger pad, written in careful block letters. 1630 B at the determined place. 1830 ingest capsules. After effect protect metals await signal mask. That was all. No signature, no date, no explanation. Just those words. The scene should have been easy to read. 2 men, strange masks, a cryptic note, an accident or a pact. But nothing in their posture, their belongings, or their surroundings offered sense. No poison vials, no signs of violence, no evidence of theft. The temperature that night dropped to around 20 degrees Celsius. The investigators took photographs, bagged the items, and carried the bodies down the hill on stretchers. They logged the discovery at 2200 hours. No one imagined that the details of this quiet hillside scene would echo across decades. Later reports would call it O Caso das Máscaras de Chumbo, the lead masks case. 2 men who left home on an errand of precision and faith, found days later on a hill overlooking the sea, their eyes shielded by metal. No motive, no cause of death, no witnesses to the moment it happened. Only a silence that felt rehearsed. They lay there, under the dim hum of the city's distant lights, untouched by the rules of ordinary crime. And somewhere in the notebook's cryptic command, a phrase that would haunt every retelling, waited the final instruction. Await signal. Their names were Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana, 2 men in their early 30s, born and raised in Campos dos Goitacazes, a city a few hours' drive north of Rio de Janeiro. They were not strangers to reason. Both were electronics technicians, skilled with soldering irons, oscilloscopes, vacuum tubes. They owned a small repair shop together, the kind of place filled with the faint smell of ozone and metal filings, where radios murmured to life beneath careful hands. They worked long hours, fixing televisions for neighbors, calibrating antennas, replacing tubes. Their world was one of circuits and voltages, of calculations written in the margins of cheap notebooks. By all accounts, they were disciplined men, quiet, dependable, sober. Neither was known for impulsive acts. But alongside their technical precision ran a quieter fascination. Spiritism was common in mid-century Brazil, a fusion of Christianity, science, and the metaphysical philosophies of Allan Kardec. Across cities, people attended seances not out of superstition, but curiosity, seeking scientific proof of the soul. Manuel and Miguel were among them. Friends later said they spoke of invisible energies, cosmic vibrations, communication across dimensions. One of them, no one recalled which, kept a book in the workshop called Life on Mars, filled with penciled annotations and diagrams of planets. They discussed it between repair jobs, mixing the vocabulary of physics with the language of faith. They did not see contradiction in that. On August 17, 1966, they left their homes in Campos. Miguel kissed his wife goodbye. Manuel told his family they were traveling to Niterói to buy car parts and electronics. They carried about 3,000 Colombian pesos in cash, roughly $70, and wore formal suits despite the heat. Their luggage was minimal: raincoats, notebooks, and a few tools. They boarded a bus bound for Rio de Janeiro, roughly 200 kilometers away. Witnesses remember them sitting quietly, speaking little, staring through the windows at the passing fields. From the bus terminal in Rio, they transferred to another route toward Niterói. They arrived before evening. What happened between that arrival and their final climb up Vintém hill remains unclear. Receipts show they bought mineral water and the plastic raincoats that were later found on their bodies. The cashier at the bar said they appeared nervous, checking their watches repeatedly, as if bound to a strict timetable. When they left, they thanked her politely. That is where the verifiable trail ends. No one saw them ascend the hill. No one saw them die. But the evidence they carried, the lead masks, the note, the time references, suggests planning, even ritual precision. To the people who knew them, it made no sense. They were rational men, technicians, believers in circuitry. They trusted systems, measurements, the steady hum of machines. Yet they also believed in another kind of current, one that flowed unseen through space and human thought alike. They lived at the threshold between science and faith, where electricity and spirit could almost be the same word. When they left home that morning, they told their families not to worry. They would be back soon. They never returned. And on the hill where they lay, their instruments replaced by masks of lead, that border between logic and belief collapsed into silence. When a mystery begins, it must pass through a familiar set of gates, rules that anchor reason, that keep the mind from drifting too far from the ground. Every investigation, no matter how strange, depends on them. Rule 1. Cause. Every death must trace back to something measurable, chemical, mechanical, or biological. A bullet, a toxin, a wound. Something that links an ending to a force. Rule 2. Context. Every event has a motive, or at least a purpose. Why they left home, why they climbed, why they chose that exact place and hour. Human behavior, when mapped, reveals intention. Rule 3. Continuity. There must be a record, receipts, footprints, witnesses, a logical trail of actions from start to finish. Rule 4. Closure. Once the data is complete, the system must converge on a single explanation that fits within physics and probability. The equation must balance. Those were the assumptions of the Niteroi police when the case began. But almost from the first hour, each rule began to fail. There was no clear cause, no external injuries, no marks of violence, no vomit, no foam, no trauma. The men's bodies were already decomposing when found, and though their internal organs were collected for testing, they were later discarded before toxicology could be performed. The coroner cited limited resources, claiming that the backlog of cases made it impossible. With that, the first rule collapsed. The second, context, also fractured. Their note provided times and actions, but not reason. Ingest capsules, it read. After effect, protect metals await signal mask. The handwriting was calm, deliberate, not the scrawl of panic or despair. They had taken care to protect the note from moisture by sealing it in plastic. This was planning, not impulse. Yet no one knew what the capsules were. None were found. Continuity failed next. Witnesses agreed on only one thing: that the men were punctual, almost obsessively so. At the bar, they checked their watches. On the hill, they arranged themselves with mathematical symmetry, but no one saw them alive beyond that moment. Their trail simply ended, mid-equation, in the tall grass. Closure, the fourth rule, was impossible. The data refused to converge. Investigators could neither prove accident, suicide, nor homicide. The lead masks, heavy and handmade, mocked every hypothesis. They offered no protection from poison, no obvious symbolic meaning. Why cut them so precisely to cover only the eyes? Why carry towels and a bottle of water, but no instruments or cameras? By the logic of ordinary investigation, the case should have resolved quickly. 2 men ingest unknown substances, die from poisoning, end of story. But their precision, the times, the attire, the masks, felt deliberate, almost procedural. It wasn't a chaotic death. It was an execution of intent, whose purpose remained invisible. The rules that guide rational inquiry are meant to hold the world steady, but on Vintém Hill, each one fell away in turn, leaving only the void between. What should have been a simple cause became an echo. What should have been an explanation became a cipher, and the line between experiment and ritual began to blur. The rules were there to keep chaos out. Instead, they revealed it. August 17th, 1966. The morning began like any other. Humid air, sunlight streaking the shop windows of Campos dos Goitacazes. At 8 o'clock, Miguel met Manuel at their workshop. They talked briefly with a friend, checked their tools, and left. They told the friend they were going to Niteroi to buy parts. It was an ordinary sentence, spoken with extraordinary calm. The bus to Rio took nearly 5 hours. Passengers later recalled 2 quiet men in suits, their briefcases resting between their shoes. They said little, watching the road unwind through fields and low hills. When they arrived in Rio, they switched buses again, heading toward Niteroi, across the Guanabara Bay. The city's skyline shimmered under a haze of afternoon heat. By mid-afternoon, they reached their destination. They bought raincoats from a local shop, even though the sky was clear. Then, at a small bar near the base of Vintém Hill, they ordered 2 bottles of mineral water. The owner remembered them glancing at their watches several times, whispering between themselves, their expressions tight with purpose. One asked for a receipt for the bottles, saying he needed to return them later to collect the deposit. It was 4:30 p.m., the first time written in the note. From that moment, the record falls silent. Somewhere near the base of the hill, they began to climb. It would have taken perhaps half an hour. The slope rises steeply through tangled grass and shrubs, the soil dry and red. From the top, you can see the bay below, the water cut by late sunlight, and the distant curve of Rio beyond. No one knows whether they paused halfway or reached the summit before 6:30. The second line of the note marks that hour. Ingest capsules. After effect, it says, protect metals. The capsules were never found. No fragments, no wrappers, no containers. And yet, something happened in that window between the 2 recorded times. Maybe they believed they were about to witness something transcendent, a light, a signal, a manifestation. Their raincoats might have been shields against the elements, or perhaps against something more abstract, radiation, energy, the unknown. At 6:30, the sun would have been setting, the air cooling, the sky burning orange over the bay, the sound of insects rising from the grass. Then, whatever it was, they followed the instruction. They lay down. Their placement suggests ritual precision. Heads turned slightly upward, hands resting near their sides, bodies aligned north to south. Beside them, the water bottle, 2 folded towels, and the note sealed in plastic. If they took something, poison, hallucinogen, or sedative, it acted silently. No contortion, no marks of resistance, just stillness. From the road below, no one saw lights that evening. No one heard cries. The hill is close enough to the city to catch its faint electric glow at night, yet remote enough for silence to swallow small sounds. When the first rain arrived later that night, it must have fallen gently on their coats, pooling in the grass around them. The next day and the next, their families assumed they were still traveling. It would take 3 days before the boy with the kite found them. From the outside, it looks like a disappearance, 2 men stepping out of a mapped world into one without coordinates. But within the strict logic of their own design, they might have believed they were following instructions exactly. They had reached the determined place. They had obeyed the appointed time. They had taken the required step. And then, as their note commanded, they had done the last thing they could. They had awaited the signal. The morning after the discovery, the hill filled with uniforms and notebooks. Investigators, reporters, locals. They moved slowly through the grass, careful not to disturb the scene. The air was heavy with decay, yet strangely calm. No marks of violence, no signs of panic. 2 neat suits, 2 silent faces, 2 fragments of metal dulling in the sun. At first, it looked simple enough. 2 men die in the open air. They must have poisoned themselves. That was the immediate conclusion. The raincoats, the note, the bottles, all could fit into a suicide pact. The lead masks, though strange, might have been symbolic, an eccentric expression of belief. The case could close easily that way, but details began to resist. No poison was found. The coroner in charge had too many other cases, so toxicology was delayed. When the samples finally reached the lab, the organs had already decomposed. The possibility of identifying any chemical traces was lost. There would be no confirmation, no cause, no closure. The police issued a preliminary statement: accidental death due to overdose of unknown substance. The press followed with a phrase that would echo for years: ritual of the lead masks. Soon, alternative explanations emerged. Some reporters claimed the men were amateur scientists attempting to contact extraterrestrial beings. Others described them as spiritists, performing an experiment to transcend physical form. A few suggested they were part of an underground group interested in parapsychology. Each theory filled the silence left by missing data. Yet each explanation fractured against the facts. If this were a suicide, why leave a receipt for bottle deposits? Why specify exact times in the note, times that imply precision and anticipation rather than despair? If it were a scientific experiment, where was the equipment? No instruments were found, no measuring devices, no cameras, no radio components, nothing that could transmit or record a signal. And if it were murder, why? There was no theft, no sign of struggle, no evidence that anyone else had been present. Investigators discovered that one of the men had previously spoken of experiments involving intense light, so bright it could blind. The lead masks might have been intended as protection against such radiance. The note's line about "protect metals" could refer to shielding sensitive instruments or to removing watches to avoid interference. Still, each answer opened a new question. The bar owner's testimony complicated things further. She said they seemed anxious, not suicidal. They checked the time obsessively, as if they were waiting for a moment that mattered. One kept glancing toward the hill, watching its slopes through the open door. Then there was the weather. The day of their ascent had been clear. No storm, no atmospheric phenomenon to explain a flash or burst of energy. Days later, the local paper printed the note in full. Readers sent letters offering interpretations: spiritual, scientific, even military. One claimed it was an encoded instruction for building an electrical device. Another saw a connection to occult numerology. The only consistent fact was that the men had followed their own timetable with absolute discipline. In a typical case, the closer investigators looked, the clearer the picture became. But here, the closer they looked, the less they could see. The facts formed a perfect outline of intention. But what filled that outline was absent. 2 men lie side by side, untouched, their watches stopped, their eyes shielded from light that never came. For the world around them, the case was solved in a headline: 2 technicians die awaiting signal from Mars. For those who stood on the hill and saw the scene firsthand, it was not solved at all. And yet, no one could deny that something had been awaited, something unseen, unrecorded, but precisely scheduled. And yet, no signal ever came. After the official reports faded from the front pages, The case survived in fragments of memory, small testimonies scattered through interviews, notebooks, and rumors. Each voice told a slightly different version of the same impossible story. The bar owner, Maria de Lourdes Sarelvas, was the last person to see them alive. She remembered their politeness, their insistence on the time. They had ordered 2 bottles of mineral water and seemed uneasy, as if calculating something invisible. She recalled one of them saying they were in a hurry to reach the spot before dark. They left, receipt in hand, walking toward the slope. Hours later, she would see their faces again, only in a newspaper photograph. The families struggled to understand. Miguel's wife said he had never spoken of suicide. He had mentioned an experiment, yes, but he had sounded calm, even excited about it. He had asked her to trust him, to wait for his return. When she heard the details, lead masks, capsules, a hill, she said quietly, he would never do such a thing unless he believed it was safe. Manuel's relatives told a similar story. He had become absorbed in spiritist ideas, reading late into the night. He had spoken of cosmic vibrations, of humanity on the edge of a great revelation. But he was not delusional, they said. He was meticulous. If he believed he could glimpse another world, he would have prepared with scientific care. Then there was Elcio, a friend who sometimes worked in their shop. He told police that the codes written in their notebook were nothing mystical, just part numbers for vacuum tubes, ECL 82, 12AU7. Yet Elcio's own behavior puzzled investigators. He had at first denied knowing their plans, then admitted they'd discussed a secret mission. Later, when questioned again, he retracted it all. The detective who took over the case a year later, Saulo Soares de Souza, spoke of interference. He said some files had disappeared, others were incomplete. He requested that the bodies be exhumed for new testing, but the order was delayed for years. By the time permission came, vital organs were missing. The truth, he said, was thrown out with the waste. The journalist, Mario Diaz, covered the story for decades. He said it haunted him more than any crime or political scandal he had reported. Every time I thought I found the final document, he wrote, another page had vanished. To him, the case was a mirror. What it reflected depended on who was looking. Years later, Jacques Vallée, a French computer scientist and UFO researcher, visited the hill himself. He wrote that even after more than a decade, the grass where the bodies had lain was still thin and pale, as if scorched. He didn't claim to know what happened, but he recognized a pattern: human beings confronting something that resists classification and constructing rituals to meet it halfway. Finally, there was Hamilton Desani, a man arrested in 1969 who claimed to know everything. He told police the technicians had been lured by criminals into a job involving explosives, and that the masks were part of the plan. But when investigators pressed him, his story shifted. Sometimes it was robbery, sometimes a ritual, sometimes a test of faith. He offered no proof. 7 voices, 7 conflicting accounts. In their differences, a strange harmony emerges. All of them describe anticipation, an act done with purpose. Whether they imagined light in the sky, or contact, or simple profit, each saw intention where others saw chaos. Truth dissolves not in contradiction, but in multiplicity. The more versions appear, the less any single one can claim authority. From a distance, these voices overlap like the hum of static, each trying to reach across time, each straining toward the same unanswered transmission. And beneath them all, one phrase continues to pulse like a faint signal through interference. Await signal. In the days after the discovery, the machinery of the state began to turn, slowly, noisily, as though waking from a long sleep. Reports were typed, forms were stamped, statements recorded. But what began as an effort to clarify would soon dissolve into confusion. The local police in Niteroi opened the initial file. Case number 2.837-66. It included sketches of the scene, photographs of the bodies, and lists of recovered objects. Within those pages, the tone was procedural, measured, bureaucratic, almost cold. 2 unknown males, apparent natural deaths. The lead masks were catalogued as improvised devices, handmade. The note was labeled simply instruction list. Nothing about it suggested panic. But a few days later, when fingerprints identified the men as the technicians from Campos, interest grew. The case transferred to a higher precinct. New officers arrived, more notebooks appeared, witnesses were re-interviewed. The initial assumption of suicide began to crack. Detective Saulo Soares de Souza took charge several months later. He was methodical, skeptical of the early conclusions. He ordered the exhumation of the bodies, arguing that proper toxicology could still be performed. But by the time he filed the request, the internal organs had already been destroyed, incinerated as medical waste after the first autopsy. There would be nothing left to test. Still, the detective pressed on. He wrote a series of internal memos, each one stamped, each one ignored. He noted discrepancies in dates, conflicting witness statements, and the absence of key evidence. One of his last reports ends with a single sentence: findings inconclusive due to procedural failure. In 1969, 3 years after the event, a man named Hamilton Desani came forward while in custody on unrelated charges. He claimed to have known the technicians, said they had been part of a criminal operation that went wrong. His testimony was inconsistent, but the police accepted it as a possible lead. The file grew thicker, more pages were added, suspect lists, letters, rumors. None of it led anywhere. By 1972, Desani escaped custody. He was recaptured the following year, insisting that he had used hypnotic powers to walk through his cell bars. The confession that once promised clarity dissolved into farce. Meanwhile, journalists requested access to the police archives. The more they searched, the more they found missing. Documents had vanished, photographs misplaced, physical evidence degraded. The lead masks themselves were transferred to storage, then reportedly lost sometime in the late 1970s. In 1980, the French researcher Jacques Vallée visited the precinct to review what remained. He found fragments, copies of sketches, transcriptions of the note, but not the originals. A clerk told him most of the boxes were destroyed in a flood. Vallée climbed the hill himself and wrote, "The ground is still bare where they lay." Grass avoids that patch as if remembering. Officially, the case was never closed, only filed under unsolved, no evidence of crime. Yet the machinery of record keeping, meant to preserve truth, had erased it. Every stamp, every signature, every typed report seemed to confirm less, not more. The system that should have imposed order instead multiplied the mystery. In the end, what remained was not an archive, but an echo chamber. pages signed, pages lost, statements made, then withdrawn. An entire investigation consumed by its own paper trail. The machine had awakened, but only to consume itself. And somewhere in its endless shuffle of memos and stamps, the words from the Hills notebook, so human, so strange, continued to pulse behind the bureaucracy like a forgotten code. A wait signal. Every unsolved story hides one element that refuses to bend, an unassimilated fragment that stands against all logic. In the case of the lead masks, it is not the note, nor the missing organs, nor even the vanished files. It is the physical scene itself. When the bodies were found, investigators noticed something strange. The men lay on a steep slope. Rain had fallen for days, yet their positions remained perfect, unmoved, undisturbed. The towels beside them were still folded. The water bottle stood upright, half embedded in the soil. No sign of sliding, no imprint of struggle. Gravity should have tugged the objects downhill, but nothing had shifted. Later, when Jacques Vallée climbed the hill 14 years afterward, he observed a second oddity. The patch of ground where the bodies had rested was bare. The surrounding grass had regrown thick and wild, but that single oval remained thin, the color of straw. As if, he wrote, the earth had absorbed something and would not forget. Forensic photographs confirm another peculiarity. The lead masks were not fastened in any way. No straps, no cords, no hinges, just thin sheets of metal molded crudely to the curvature of a human face. Lead is heavy. A mask like that should have slipped from the skin. Yet one was still resting perfectly over its wearer's eyes when police arrived, tilted slightly upward, as though he had adjusted it to look toward the sky. One investigator noted the shape of the cut edges, smooth, almost surgical. They had been made with a steady hand, not with the rough tools of a workshop improvisation. The pieces were identical in size, as if traced from the same pattern. Both masks bore faint scratches along the inner surface, suggesting repeated handling. Why would two technicians, trained to measure and calculate, fashion protective gear that covers only the eyes? If they feared radiation, they would have built full visors. If they feared light, why not goggles or smoked glass? Lead would block vision entirely. To wear such masks would be to choose blindness. Unless blindness was the point, the note's instruction, protect metals await signal mask, implies anticipation of something radiant, something visible yet dangerous. Maybe they expected a flash. Maybe they believed a revelation would appear only when sight was denied. The decomposition reports add to the unease. The coroner noted that both bodies decayed rapidly, more quickly than expected for the temperature and altitude. Yet the surrounding vegetation showed no sign of disturbance, no scent strong enough to attract animals. The scene was untouched, as though sealed under a dome of still air. And the most baffling of all, the electrical watches found among their possessions had stopped at different times. One at 4:35, the other at 4:40, roughly the window when they were last seen alive. Watches rarely stop simultaneously without external cause. Taken together, these fragments defy arrangement. The earth remembers where they lay. Their masks resist gravity. Their watches halt mid-moment. Their objects remain frozen in perfect geometry after days of rain. These are not mystical claims. They are documented facts. And yet, when placed side by side, they seem to conspire against the natural order of things. For investigators, such details were the edge of reason, the place where deduction gave way to vertigo. Beyond that point lay only speculation, an unseen force, a self-inflicted ritual, a signal that required surrender. To others, it was proof that something extraordinary had occurred on that hill, something that erased motion, disturbed growth, and left behind a silence shaped exactly like two human forms. Even now, decades later, that impossible detail remains. A patch of barren earth where nothing grows. Two masks that should have fallen but did not. A moment that should have passed, still waiting for its signal. Time is supposed to dissolve mystery, to grind its edges smooth, but some stories resist erosion. The lead masks of Vintém Hill have now been gone for nearly 60 years, and still the outline of their riddle has not faded. The case reappears every decade like a low echo from the past. In the 1970s, it lived on in newspaper retrospectives. In the 1980s, it was revived by paranormal researchers, each offering their own translation of the note. The words "await signal" became an incantation, a bridge between the scientific and the sacred. Local legends grew. Children were told not to climb the hill after sunset. Some said strange lights appeared on humid nights, small flashes like camera bulbs beneath the clouds. Others spoke of faint humming, of radios picking up static bursts whenever tuned near the hill. None of it was recorded, yet everyone in the neighborhood seemed to know someone who had seen something. In the 1990s, the story resurfaced on television. A popular crime show reconstructed the events, hiring actors to lie still on the same slope where the real men had died. When the episode aired, the switchboard flooded with calls. Former police officers, surviving relatives, amateur historians, all claiming to possess the missing link. None did. By the early 2000s, the archive that once held the original evidence was reduced to fragments. Water damage, bureaucratic neglect, misplacement. The lead masks themselves vanished from inventory, presumed melted down or lost. All that remains today are photographs, a typed transcript of the note, and the collective memory of a case that refuses to end. Writers, podcasters, filmmakers have all returned to it. Each time, the tone changes. Some call it a spiritual experiment gone wrong. Others, an accident of chemistry, perhaps a hallucinogenic substance mismeasured by amateurs. Some, more cautiously, call it a fable about faith and science colliding in the tropics of the 20th century. But the myth is larger than the data now. The hill has become a site of quiet pilgrimage. People climb it on anniversaries, leaving offerings, candles, photographs, folded bits of foil shaped into small masks. They come not seeking proof, but presence. In Campos dos Goitacazes, the men's families aged and died without answers. Their descendants stopped correcting journalists. The photographs of their fathers, young, serious, wearing pressed shirts, hang in living rooms as if they were explorers who vanished beyond the map. The long shadow of their story stretches across generations because it is more than a crime. It is a metaphor for the human wish to see the unseen, to touch the edge of the infinite. On paper, they were technicians. In legend, they are pilgrims who climbed a hill to meet the sky. And somewhere, in the echo that still hums beneath every retelling, that phrase returns, softly, insistently. The pulse of an unanswered transmission awaits signal. At the foot of Vintém Hill, the city moves as it always has. Buses rattle down the road, children play in the dust, and above them the hill stands silent, its slopes overgrown and indifferent. The grass has changed color, the trees have shifted shape, but the coordinates have not. If you climb it now, the air grows still about halfway up. The sound of the city fades. The wind that brushes through the tall weeds sounds almost like breathing. There are no signs to mark the spot, no memorials or plaques, just an expanse of grass that dips slightly, as though remembering the weight of two bodies. People who visit describe an odd feeling there. Not fear exactly, something closer to recognition, as if the place itself recalls the moment when two men lay down and waited for what they believed would come. We know their names, we know the route they took, we know what they carried and the words they wrote, but every piece of knowledge circles the same absence. Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira de Cruz did not vanish. They simply crossed a threshold we cannot chart. Whether they reached for revelation, or miscalculated a chemical, or trusted a signal that never arrived, we cannot tell. The evidence is gone, the silence remains. What endures is the symmetry of the story. Two men of reason drawn toward the unmeasurable, two lives suspended between circuitry and soul. Their tools failed, their bodies failed, but their question endures. The boy who found them would be old now if he still lives. Perhaps he remembers the wind, the color of the sky, the dull gleam of those masks in the grass. Perhaps he remembers how still the hill became, as if time itself had stopped to listen. That stillness is what remains, more than any theory or headline. A silence shaped like two men who believed that something would answer them back. We have followed their story through documents and ghosts, through science and superstition, through the machinery of truth and the persistence of myth. We end where they ended, looking toward a sky that never replied. Maybe the signal they awaited was never meant for the living. Maybe we're still learning to hear it. If you believe these shadows are more than absence, keep the candle lit and let it burn a little longer for the questions that never fade. Thank you for watching and for keeping these forgotten stories alive. Until next time, good night from the Midnight Archives.